If you're ready for a heartfelt journey filled with love, family, and the courage to mend what's broken, you're in the right place. Before we begin, please give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. It helps us share more stories that warm the soul. Now, let's step into a world where honor lights the way. The silk of my wedding dress clung to my skin, cold and heavy, as if it carried the weight of a vow I never chose. I stood alone in the ancient church of Willow Grove, my breath trembling in the dim air, mingling with the patter of rain against stained glass windows. The scent of wax and lilies hung thick, like a prayer unspoken, while flickering candles cast shadows on the worn wooden pews. My heart thudded, a trapped bird in my chest, as I faced the altar where my life would change forever. Today, I, Clara Bennett, 24 and untouched by love, would marry James Hawthorne, a man I'd never met, a stranger whose name alone felt like a chain. I smoothed my trembling hands over the gown, its fabric whispering against my palms, and thought of Mama. Eleanor, with her frail smile and fading strength, lay in a hospital bed, her heart faltering under the burden of debts my brother Thomas had spun like a reckless web. This marriage was my sacrifice, my duty to save her, to keep our family from crumbling. Yet, as I stood there, the word duty tasted bitter, like coffee left too long on the stove. I wanted more. Not just survival, but the kind of love Mama used to dream of. The kind she'd whisper about when we folded linens together, her voice soft as sunlight. One day, Clara, you'll find someone whose look stops your heart. The organ began its mournful hymn, and my gaze lifted to the man waiting at the altar. James Hawthorne stood tall, his broad shoulders cutting a stark silhouette against the candlelight. His face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a jaw like carved stone, but it was his eyes that pierced me, deep brown and cold as a winter dusk. He wore a tailored suit, black as midnight, and an air of command that made the air feel thinner. A CEO, they said, a titan of Philadelphia's elite, ruthless in boardrooms and life. I swallowed, my throat tight, as I walked toward him, each step echoing like a gavel in my mind. The priest's voice droned, words blurring into the rain's soft rhythm, but James's gaze never wavered. When he spoke his vow, "This is your duty," his voice was low, a velvet command that sent a shiver down my spine. Duty. The word stung, stripping away the dreams I'd sown into the quiet hours at my little tailor shop, where the hum of my sewing machine was my only song. I nodded, lips pressed tight, and extended my hand for the ring. His fingers brushed mine, and I froze. They were warm, unexpectedly so, and for a fleeting moment, his touch lingered, a faint tremor beneath his steadiness. My breath caught, and, when I looked up, his eyes flicked to the silver ring on my other hand. Mama's ring, worn and simple, before returning to mine. Something flickered in his gaze, a shadow of something unspoken, and then it was gone, sealed behind that icy mask. The ceremony ended in a blur, and I found myself in the vestry, alone. The damp chill of the church seeping through my dress. My fingers fumbled with my veil, and as I set it aside, I noticed Mama's old jewelry box on the table, left from when she'd helped me dress weeks ago, before her latest hospital stay. I opened it, the hinges creaking, and there, tucked beneath, a faded ribbon, was a letter, its edges yellowed like forgotten promises. My name curled across the front in Mama's elegant script, and my heart stuttered. I unfolded it, the paper crisp under my fingers, and read, "Clara, my light, honor is the fire in your heart. Never let it dim." The words blurred as tears pricked my eyes, and I pressed the letter to my chest, the scent of old ink faint but grounding. I closed my eyes, and a memory bloomed, vivid as daylight. I was 10, sitting by the window in our cramped kitchen, Mama's hair glowing gold in the afternoon sun. She taught me to fold a handkerchief, her hands guiding mine, her voice steady. Honor is keeping your word, Clara, even when it hurts. I'd laughed then, my fingers clumsy, but now, standing in this church, I understood. She'd kept her word through every hardship. Papa's betrayal, Thomas's mistakes, her own fading health. This marriage was my promise to her, but the letter felt heavier, as if it held a secret she hadn't yet shared. What was she trying to tell me? Footsteps broke my reverie, and I turned to see James in the doorway, his presence filling the small room like a storm held at bay. "It's time," he said, his voice softer now, though still edged with authority. He stepped closer, and I noticed the rain had left faint droplets on his coat, catching the candlelight like tiny stars. He offered his hand, and I hesitated, the letter still warm against my palm. I slipped it into my pocket, its weight a quiet anchor, and placed my hand in his. His grip was firm but not unkind, and as he led me out, his thumb brushed the back of my hand, a fleeting warmth that made my pulse skip. His eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat, they weren't cold. There was a question there, a crack in his armor, gone before I could name it. We stepped into the rain, the world beyond the church a haze of gray, and I felt the silk of my dress grow heavier, clinging like a second skin. James opened an umbrella, his arm steady above me, and I wondered if this was how it began. Honor, duty, perhaps even love. The letter burned in my pocket, Mama's words echoing, "The fire in your heart." I didn't know what lay ahead, but as James's shadow fell over me, I sensed a spark, faint but stubborn, waiting to ignite. The Philadelphia mansion stretched around me like a gilded cage, its long corridors heavy with the scent of sandalwood and the relentless tick of a grandfather clock. I sat in a small room I'd claimed as my own, sunlight filtering through lace curtains, casting dappled patterns on the silk fabric in my hands. My sewing needle moved in steady rhythm, each stitch a tether to the life I'd left behind. My tailor shop in Willow Grove, where the hum of my machine and the smell of fresh cotton were my world. Now, married to James Hawthorne, I felt like a bird with clipped wings, my heart caught between duty and a longing I barely understood. I paused, my fingers brushing the soft weave, and thought of Mama's letter, tucked safely in my pocket. "Honor is the fire in your heart," she'd written, and I clung to those words, though they couldn't warm the chill of this place. James was a shadow here, his presence fleeting. A nod at breakfast, a glance from across the dining room, his eyes deep brown and unreadable. He was the ruthless millionaire they whispered of, a man who commanded empires. Yet I knew nothing of him beyond the vow that bound us. I wondered if love, the kind Mama dreamed of, a look that could stop your heart, could ever grow in such a barren soil. The needle pricked my finger, a sharp sting pulling me back, and I sighed, setting the fabric aside. It was a handkerchief, half-stitched with a rose pattern I'd started for Mama before her hospital stay. I reached for my phone, craving her voice, and dialed the video call. The screen flickered, and there she was. Eleanor, her face pale but her smile a fragile light. "Clara, my girl," she said, her voice trembling like autumn leaves. "You're my brightness." I held a teacup, its warmth seeping into my palms, but her words pierced me, a reminder of why I was here. "I'm trying, Mama," I whispered, my throat tight. "I'll keep us safe." I saw her hospital room behind her, sterile and cold, and a memory bloomed. I was 12, sitting cross-legged in our kitchen, Mama teaching me to embroider. Her hands, steady despite years of toil, guided mine over the cloth. Her laughter soft as she said, "Every stitch is a promise, Clara. Make them strong." I'd fumbled then, my roses lopsided, but her pride had warmed me like summer. Now, watching her frail form, I felt that promise again, to mend our family, to keep her fire burning. But how, in this mansion, where every door felt locked? A shadow crossed the doorway, and I looked up to find James, his tall frame filling the space. His suit was impeccable, charcoal gray, but his eyes held a quiet storm. "You're settling in?" he asked, his voice low, almost careful. I nodded, clutching the handkerchief, and his gaze drifted to it, lingering on the rose pattern. He stepped closer, and my breath hitched as he reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric, slow and deliberate, as if tracing a memory. "Who taught you this?" he asked, his tone softer, a crack in his usual steel. I swallowed, the air suddenly thick. "My mother," I said. And for a moment our eyes met, his searching, mine uncertain, and I felt a spark, faint but unsettling, like a candle flickering in the dark. He pulled back, the moment gone, and I wondered what he'd seen in those stitches. "It's beautiful," he said, then turned to leave, his footsteps echoing down the hall. I sat frozen, my heart pounding, the handkerchief warm where his fingers had been. Why had he lingered? What lay behind that question? I wanted to believe there was more to him than the cold vow we'd shared, but doubt gnawed at me, sharp as the needle's prick. Later, I visited Mama's hospital records online, checking her treatment plan, and my breath caught. The latest bill, thousands of dollars for her heart medication, had been marked paid in full. My fingers trembled as I scrolled, finding no trace of my own funds. It could only be James. I marched to his study, the mansion's silence pressing against me, and found him behind a mahogany desk, papers scattered under lamplight. The air smelled of ink and coffee, sharp and grounding. "Did you pay for my mother's treatment?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He looked up, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment I thought he'd deny it. "It's part of the deal," he said. His tone clipped, but his gaze held mine, unwavering, as if daring me to see more. I wanted to press him, to ask why he'd hidden it, but something in his posture, rigid, like a man guarding a wound, stopped. "Me. Thank you," I said instead, and turned away, my heart a tangle of gratitude and confusion. Back in my room, I pulled out Mama's letter, its edges soft from my touch, and reread her words. Never let it dim. I held the handkerchief, its roses half-formed, and thought of her hands guiding mine, her voice promising strength. James's touch on the fabric lingered in my mind, warm and unexpected, and I wondered if he too carried a fire he didn't show. I didn't know what love was, not yet, but as I stitched another petal, I felt a quiet hope, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Maybe, just maybe, this cage could hold a spark worth kindling. The kitchen in our old Willow Grove house smelled of coffee, bitter and warm, like the mornings when Mama would hum her lullabies, her voice weaving through the steam. I sat across, from her now, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug, its heat a faint comfort against the ache in my chest. Mama's face was pale, her eyes sunken, but her smile held a strength that made my throat tighten. She'd called me back from James's mansion, her voice urgent yet soft over the phone, and I'd come running, the weight of her letter. Honor is the fire in your heart, still heavy in my pocket. "Clara, my light," she said, her words trembling like a candle in the wind. "There's something I've kept from you." She reached across the table, her hand frail but steady, and pressed a silver ring into my palm. Its surface was worn smooth, etched with tiny vines, and I felt her pulse beneath my fingers, faint and fluttering, like a bird too tired to fly. I wanted to protest, to say she needed it more, but her gaze held mine, resolute, and I stayed silent, my breath catching on, the edge of tears. She leaned back, the wooden chair creaking, and the morning light caught the gray in her hair, turning it to silver. "Your father," she began, her voice low. "He wasn't the man you thought." My heart stuttered, and I gripped the ring, its cool metal grounding me. Papa had been a ghost in our lives, gone when I was too young to remember, leaving only stories of laughter and betrayal. "He gambled, Clara, more than we could bear," she said. "The debts Thomas carries, they started with him. I hid it to protect you, to keep our family whole." Her eyes glistened, and I saw the years she'd carried alone, each one a stitch in a wound I'd never noticed. The air grew heavy, the coffee's scent now sharp, stinging my nose. Guilt clawed at me. I'd blamed her silence, her sacrifices, even as I'd sown my own life into this marriage to save her. "Why now, Mama?" I asked, my voice breaking. She reached for my hand again, her touch a lifeline. "Because honor isn't perfection," she said. "It's mending what's broken, even when it hurts." I pressed her hand to my cheek, feeling the faint throb of her pulse, and a memory surged. Her singing to me as a child, her lullaby wrapping me in safety while rain tapped the roof. That girl hadn't known the cost of love, but this woman, staring into her mother's eyes, did. I returned to the mansion that evening, the Philadelphia skyline a blur of lights beyond the car window. James's study glowed softly when I entered, the air thick with the scent of old paper and cedar. He stood by a bookshelf, his silhouette sharp against the lamplight, his dark suit a contrast to the warmth of the room. I hesitated, the ring heavy in my pocket. Mama's words echoing. "Mend what's broken." "James," I said, my voice steadier. Then I felt, "I need to tell you something." He turned, his eyes narrowing, but he nodded, gesturing to a leather chair. I sat, the fabric cool against my hands, and poured out Mama's truth. Papa's betrayal, the debts, her years of silence. My voice shook as I admitted my guilt, expecting judgment. But James stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. He knelt, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, and I froze, the warmth of his touch seeping through my blouse. "You're not your father," he said, his voice low, almost tender. His eyes, usually so cold, held a quiet fire, and he added, "I know what it's like to lose family." The words hung between us, heavy as the cedar in the air, and I saw a flicker of pain in his gaze, a crack in the armor he wore. My heart raced, not from fear but from something new, a pull toward him, fragile yet undeniable. "What do you mean?" I asked, but he stood, his hand falling away, and the moment slipped like sand. "Another time," he said, turning back to his books, but his voice lingered, soft as a promise. Later, I sat by my laptop, video calling Mama again. Her hospital room was dim, the beep of machines a faint rhythm, but her face brightened when she saw me. I held a cloth, wiping imaginary sweat from my fingers, and told her about James's words, his touch. "He's not what I thought," I said, and she smiled, her eyes knowing. "Honor runs deep, Clara," she said. "In you, in him." I nodded, my throat tight, and as I ended the call, I pulled out her letter, tracing its words with my finger. The ring glinted on my hand, a reminder of her strength, and I felt a resolve take root, to mend our family, to find the light Mama believed in. James's study was empty now, but the scent of cedar clung to me, and I thought of his hand on my shoulder, steady yet burdened. I didn't know his story, not yet, but I sensed a fire in him too, hidden beneath the ice. As I walked back to my room, the mansion's silence no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a space where something might grow, if I dared to let it. The soft hum of my sewing machine filled the little tailor shop in Willow Grove, a melody that tethered me to the life I'd once known. Sunlight spilled through the window, catching the dust motes dancing over bolts of silk, their sheen a quiet promise of beauty yet to be shaped. I paused, my fingers tracing a half-stitched rose on a handkerchief for Mama, when the bell above the door jingled. Thomas stepped in, his shoulders hunched, his eyes, blue like mine but shadowed with guilt, darting nervously. "Clara," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. My heart clenched, and I stood, the fabric slipping from my hands. Thomas, my little brother, looked smaller than I remembered, as if the weight of his mistakes had carved away the boy who'd once chased fireflies with me. I crossed the room, the floorboards creaking under my steps, and pulled him into a hug. His frame trembled against mine, and I felt him sink into me, like he had as a child when nightmares woke him. I won't let you fall, Thomas, I whispered, my voice steady despite the ache inside. Never again. I thought of Mama's words. Honor is mending what's broken, and held him tighter, the scent of his worn jacket, like earth and regret, grounding me. As I released him, a memory flickered. Mama teaching us to fold napkins at our old kitchen table, her laughter warm as she said, "Loyalty is the thread that binds us, stronger than any silk." I'd believed her then, and now, standing in my shop, I vowed to weave that thread for Thomas, to mend the tears his debts had torn in our family. But the silk beneath my fingers felt fragile, and I wondered if love, the kind Mama dreamed of, a look to stop your heart, could ever fit into this tangled web. Back at James's Philadelphia mansion, the air carried a different weight, sharp with the scent of coffee and the distant hum of the city. I was threading a needle in my makeshift sewing room when a stranger's voice echoed down the hall. Richard Langley, a former partner of James, his tone oily and precise. I followed the sound to the parlor, where Richard stood, his smile sharp as a blade. "A convenient bride," he said to James, gesturing toward me as I lingered in the doorway. "A way to polish your name, isn't it?" My stomach twisted, the silk scarf in my hand suddenly heavy, and I looked to James, expecting a defense. But he stood silent, his jaw tight, his eyes dark and unreadable, like a storm held at bay. The accusation stung, and I fled to James's office later, the glass walls reflecting the city's glow, the air thick with the bitter tang of espresso. My breath came fast, each inhale sharp as I faced him across his desk. "Is this a game?" I asked, my voice trembling but firm. "Did you marry me for your reputation?" The words burned, raw with the fear that I was nothing more than a pawn in his world of power. James leaned back, his fingers steepled, and for a moment, I thought he'd dismiss me. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low, edged with something I couldn't name. Anger, perhaps, or pain. His eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of turmoil, a crack in his polished facade, but he said no more. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, but a file on his desk caught my eye. Financial records stamped with red ink. Canceled. My fingers brushed the paper and I froze, reading the details. A major contract, worth millions, abandoned to settle Thomas's debts. James had done this quietly at a cost to his empire. My breath caught, and I looked back at him, but he was staring out the window, his silhouette rigid against the dusk. That evening, I found him in the garden, where roses bloomed crimson under the fading sun. The air smelled of earth and twilight, and I stepped closer, my scarf fluttering in the breeze. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice softer now, searching. "Why pay Thomas's debts?" James turned, his face half lit by the golden glow, and his hand reached for mine, his fingers warm as they closed over my own. "I did it for you," he said, his voice rough, like a confession torn free. His thumb brushed my knuckles, slow and deliberate, and I felt his breath pause, as if he feared I'd pull away. I didn't. The roses seemed to glow brighter, their petals soft against the fading light, and I saw Mama's face in my mind, her smile as she spoke of loyalty, of love. I tightened my grip, the warmth of his hand seeping into me, and whispered, "Thank you." Our eyes locked, and for the first time, I saw not the ruthless man I'd married, but someone carrying his own unseen burdens. My heart stirred, a quiet hope unfurling, and I thought of Mama's letter, her fire. Maybe loyalty wasn't just a thread. It was a bridge, one James and I were beginning to cross. The hospital corridor stretched before me, a tunnel of white light and sharp antiseptic, each step echoing like a heartbeat too loud to bear. My hands trembled, clutching Mama's silver ring, its worn vines pressing into my palm as I ran toward her room. The call had come an hour ago, her heart failing, a sudden collapse, and fear clawed at me, raw and relentless. I saw her in my mind, frail but fierce, her smile the fire that had lit my life, and I couldn't lose her. Not now. Not ever. The door loomed ahead, and I pushed through, the beep of machines slicing the air like a warning. Mama lay still, her face pale as the sheets, her chest rising faintly under the weight of wires. I sank beside her, grasping her hand, her pulse a fragile thread beneath my fingers. "Mama, please," I whispered, my voice cracking, tears hot on my cheeks. The room smelled of medicine and wilting flowers, a cruel contrast to the memory that flooded me, her teaching me to brew tea in our Willow Grove kitchen, her hands steady as she poured, her voice soft. "A good cup warms the soul, Clara. Make it with love." I'd giggled then, spilling leaves. But now, holding her hand, I prayed for one more chance to share that warmth. Hours blurred, my eyes fixed on her, until a shadow crossed the doorway. James stood there, his suit rumpled, his face etched with a tension I hadn't seen before. His eyes, deep brown, met mine, and for a moment the world stilled. "How is she?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I shook my head, unable to speak, and he stepped closer, the scent of cedar clinging to him, grounding me in the sterile haze. "I've arranged for the best surgeon," he said, and I froze, realizing he'd paid for her care again. This time, a lifeline I couldn't have dreamed. Anger flared, sharp and sudden. "I don't need your pity," I snapped, standing, my hands clenched. I'd fought so hard to stand on my own, to mend our family without owing more than I already did. James's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. He reached for my hand, his fingers closing over mine, warm and unyielding, and I felt his pulse, steady where mine raced. "It's not pity," he said, his voice rough, breaking. "I need you to live, Clara." His eyes burned, raw with a fear I hadn't expected, as if losing me would unravel him. My breath caught, and I saw not the ruthless man I'd married, but someone who'd carried his own losses, hidden deep. I stood frozen, his words echoing, Mama's words too. "Honor is mending what's broken." I wanted to pull away, to guard my heart, but his touch held me, a bridge I hadn't dared cross. Before I could speak, a nurse interrupted. Mama was stable, waking soon. Relief flooded me, and I sank back to her bedside, still holding James's hand, his warmth a quiet anchor. When Mama's eyes fluttered open, I leaned close, my voice trembling as I spoke. "You taught me to make tea, remember?" I said, smiling, through tears. "You said love makes it better." Her lips curved, faint but real, and she squeezed my hand, her pulse stronger now, like a promise kept. I told her about James, how he'd fought for her, and her eyes softened, seeing him behind me. "You're finding each other," she whispered, and I felt the truth of it, a spark igniting where fear had been. Later, in James's mansion, I found him in the parlor, the air heavy with the glow of a single lamp and the scent of old wood. Margaret, Mama's friend, had visited earlier, her voice warm as she'd shared a story, how she and Mama had sewn a wedding quilt long ago, dreaming of love that endured. "James fought for you," she'd said, like Eleanor did for her family. Now, standing before him, I saw him anew. "Why?" I asked, my voice soft, searching. Why do you keep saving us? He stepped closer, the lamp casting shadows across his face, and his hands found mine, his thumbs tracing slow circles over my knuckles. Because you're my home, he said, his voice low, raw, like a vow he hadn't planned. My heart leapt, and I felt it then. The love Mama had spoken, of not a fire that consumed, but a warmth that grew, steady and true. I stepped into his arms, my cheek against his chest, his heartbeat a rhythm that matched my own. The silk of my blouse brushed his jacket, soft as a sigh, and I closed my eyes, letting his embrace hold me, a shelter I hadn't known I needed. We stood there, wrapped in quiet, and I thought of Mama's quilt. Each stitch a story of endurance. James's arms were no longer a chain. They were a promise, one I was beginning to return. I felt her ring on my finger, its vines a reminder of her strength, and I knew I was mending something broken, not just for her, but for us. Love, I realized, was the fire she'd always meant, and in James's hold, it was finally mine. The library in James's mansion smelled of old books and secrets, the kind that clung to leather bindings and whispered in the quiet. I stood at the threshold, my fingers trembling against the door frame, the air heavy with the weight of what I'd just learned. Richard Langley's voice echoed in my mind, sharp and venomous from a chance meeting at a charity event. James could have saved your father, Clara, but his pride stopped him. The words had cut deep, reopening wounds I thought I'd buried with Mama's truth about Papa's betrayal. Now, facing James's world of polished shelves and lamplight, I needed answers, even if they broke me. I stepped inside, the floor creaking, under my shoes, and found James by a bookcase, his silhouette softened by the glow of a single bulb. His dark sweater hugged his frame, and his hands, usually so steady, paused on a volume, as if sensing my presence. Clara, he said, turning, his eyes narrowing with a question. The scent of paper and cedar wrapped around us, grounding me as my heart raced. I clutched Mama's silver ring, its vines pressing into my palm, and took a breath, the air sharp, in my lungs. Did you let my father fall? I asked, my voice low but steady, each word a stone dropped into still water. James's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he'd deflect, his usual shield of control snapping into place. But he set the book down, his fingers lingering on its spine, and met my gaze. I was wrong, he said, his voice rough, like gravel underfoot. The admission stunned me, and I stood frozen, the lamplight casting shadows across his face, revealing lines of regret I hadn't seen before. My father, he continued, stepping closer. He let power blind him, tore our family apart. I swore I'd never be him, but when your father came to me, drowning in debt, I turned him away. I thought it was strength. His words hung heavy, and I felt a pang. Not just for Papa, but for James, carrying a past that mirrored my own. The library seemed to shrink, the walls closing in with the weight of our truths. I wanted to hate him, to cling to the anger that felt safe, but Mama's voice rose in my memory, clear as a bell. I was 8, curled on our porch swing, her arms around me after I'd fought with Thomas. Forgiveness is the fire in your heart, Clara, she'd said, her breath warm against my hair. It doesn't erase the hurt. It lights the way forward. I'd nodded then, not understanding, but now, staring into James's eyes, I felt that fire stir, fragile but insistent. He moved to a desk, his hand brushing a drawer, and pulled out something that made my breath catch. Mama's letter. Its yellowed edges unmistakable. I found it in the vestry after our wedding, he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. I kept it for you. He held it out, and I took it, my fingers grazing his, warm and steady. The paper trembled in my hands, and I saw her words, again, Honor is the fire in your heart. My throat tightened, and I looked up, finding his eyes not cold but searching, as if he needed my forgiveness as much as I needed his truth. I stepped closer, the scent of cedar mingling with the faint musk of his sweater, and rested a hand on his arm, feeling the tension beneath. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of something new. A bridge between us, built on shared scars. He didn't pull away, and for a moment, we stood there, the library's silence wrapping us like a quilt. Later, we sat by the fireplace in the parlor, the crackle of logs filling the air, their glow painting, his face in hues of gold and shadow. The warmth seeped into my hands, curled around a mug of tea, and I told him about Mama's lesson on forgiveness, how she'd held me through my childish grudges, her voice a lullaby of second chances. "She taught me to see the good," I said, and James nodded, his gaze distant but soft. "My mother tried to teach me that," he said, his voice low. "But I learned too late." He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and I felt our pulses align, steady and sure. The firelight danced, and I thought of Mama's quilt, the one she'd sewn with Margaret, each patch a story of endurance. Forgiveness wasn't easy. It was a choice like stitching a torn seam, and I was choosing it now, for James, for myself. I squeezed his hand, the silver ring glinting between us, and saw a smile flicker on his lips, small but real. "We're not our parents," I said, and he nodded, his thumb brushing my knuckles, a silent vow. As the fire burned low, I felt the weight of pride lift, replaced by something lighter, hope perhaps, or the beginning of love. Mama's letter lay on the table, its words a beacon, and I knew honor wasn't just keeping promises. It was daring to mend what pride had broken, together. The bell above my tailor shop door in Willow Grove jingled, a sharp note cutting through, the hum of my sewing machine. I looked up, my fingers pausing on a silk scarf, its threads catching the late afternoon light like whispered promises. Thomas stood there, his face pale, eyes wide with a fear I hadn't seen since he was a boy, caught in a storm. "Clara," he said, his voice trembling. "I messed up again." My heart sank, the air thick with the scent of cotton and dread, and I rose, the scarf slipping to the floor like a fallen hope. He slumped into a chair, hands twisting, and confessed. Richard Langley had lured him into a risky investment, promising quick money to clear his debts. "I thought I could fix things," he said. And I saw the boy who'd once broken Mama's vase, desperate to glue it back. I knelt before him, the floorboards cool against my knees, and pulled him into a hug, his frame shaking against mine. "I won't let you fall," I whispered, my voice steady as I pressed my cheek to his hair, its earthy scent grounding me. "Not ever." I thought of Mama's lesson at our kitchen table, her hands folding napkins as she said, "Loyalty is the thread that binds us, Clara." I'd promised to weave that thread, and I meant to keep it, no matter the cost. But fear gnawed at me. Thomas's mistake could unravel everything, drag us back to the debt that had chained me to James. I drove to the mansion in Philadelphia, the city lights blurring through my tears, and found James in his office, the air sharp with the bitter tang of coffee. Papers littered his desk, and his eyes, deep brown, lifted to meet mine, a storm brewing beneath their calm. "Clara," he said, standing, his voice low but alert, sensing my distress. I took a breath, the glass walls reflecting my trembling silhouette, and said, "Thomas is in trouble. Richard's trapped him in a bad deal. Please, help him." I expected hesitation, a reminder of the debts he'd already paid, but James's jaw tightened, and he nodded, his hand brushing mine, warm and fleeting. "I'll handle it," he said, and I saw his fingers clench, as if gripping something he couldn't afford to lose. I wanted to ask what it meant, but his gaze held me, steady and sure, and I trusted him, a quiet faith blooming where doubt had been. Days later, I learned the truth from a crumpled letter on his desk, its ink stark against the page. James had canceled a vital contract, a deal that could have expanded his empire, to funnel funds to Richard's scheme, freeing Thomas at a cost to his own legacy. My breath caught, and I clutched Mama's silver ring, its vines a reminder of her fire. Why had he done it, after all we'd been through? I found him in the garden, where roses glowed crimson under the setting sun, their petals soft against the cooling air. The sky burned gold, and James stood alone, his shoulders tense, his face half-shadowed. "Why do you keep saving us?" I asked, my voice soft, almost lost in the breeze. He turned, his eyes meeting mine, and the world seemed to pause, the roses holding their breath. He stepped closer, his hand finding mine, fingers intertwining, warm and strong. "Because I belong to you," he said, his voice rough, raw, like a truth he'd fought to hide. His thumb traced my palm, slow and deliberate, and I felt his pulse, quick and vulnerable, mirroring my own. My heart leapt, and I saw Mama's smile in my mind, her dreams of love, a look to stop your heart, alive in his gaze. I stepped into his arms, my cheek against his chest, the wool of his sweater soft under my skin. His heartbeat thrummed, a rhythm I wanted to learn, and I whispered, "Thank you," my voice thick with tears. The garden faded, leaving only us, wrapped in the fading light, and I knew this was loyalty, not just to family, but to him, to us. That evening, Mama came, to the mansion, her steps slow but steady, her face brighter than I'd seen in months. The parlor smelled of fresh flowers, their sweetness mingling with the crackle of the fireplace, and she sat between us, her hands reaching for ours. Her fingers, frail but warm, closed over mine and James's, linking us, and she smiled, her eyes gleaming. "You've found each other," she said, her voice a lullaby, and I felt her strength, the fire she'd passed to me. I nodded, tears falling, and saw James's hand tighten around hers, a silent vow. As Mama spoke of old days, her quilt with Margaret, her hopes for us, I leaned against James, his arm steady around me. I thought of her lessons, her love, and knew happiness wasn't just family or love. It was both, woven together, stronger than any silk. In his arms, I was home, and I'd keep that promise. Always. The scent of fresh cotton filled my tailor shop in Willow Grove, a quiet hymn that welcomed me home. Sunlight poured through the window, dusting the bolts of silk with gold, and I ran my fingers over a new scarf, its threads soft as a sigh. The sewing machine hummed under my touch, each stitch a note in a melody I'd thought I'd lost. I was Clara Bennett, no longer bound by a cold vow, but woven into something stronger, a love I'd found, a family I'd mended. Mama's silver ring glinted on my hand, its vines catching the light, and I smiled, feeling her fire alive in me. I stepped outside, the bell jingling, and saw Mama in the garden, her shawl loose around her shoulders, her face brighter than it had been in years. She knelt by a rose bush, humming a lullaby, the same one she'd sung when I was small, its notes wrapping me in warmth. I joined her, the grass cool beneath my knees, and she handed me a bloom, its petals velvet against my palm. "You've grown strong, Clara," she said, her voice steady now, no longer trembling. I hugged her, breathing in the faint lavender of her shawl, and felt her heartbeat, a rhythm that anchored me. "Because of you," I whispered, and her smile was my sun. We walked to the old church where I'd married James, its stone walls now bathed in morning light, the stained glass glowing like a promise kept. James waited inside, his tall frame, softened by a sweater, his eyes deep brown and warm, no longer the cold dusk I'd once feared. He took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and led me to the altar, where candles flickered, their wax scent mingling with the air. "I came here as a boy," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "My mother taught me to pray, to believe in something bigger." He paused, his thumb brushing my knuckles, and I saw a flicker of her in his eyes. A woman who'd dreamed, as Mama had. "You've taught me honor," he said, turning to me, his gaze steady, like a vow renewed. My heart swelled, and I leaned closer, the silk of my blouse brushing his arm. "And you're my home," I replied, my voice soft but sure, the words a truth I'd grown into. I thought of Mama's dreams, a look to stop your heart, and realized they weren't dreams anymore. They were here, in James's eyes, in the warmth of his hand, in the life we were building. We stood there, the church quiet save for our breaths, and I felt the weight of our beginning lift, replaced by something eternal. Back at the mansion, we gathered in the parlor, the air rich with the crackle of the fireplace and the sweetness of fresh tea. Mama sat beside us, pouring from a pot, her hands steady as they'd been when she'd taught me to brew it, her laughter light as she recounted old stories, her quilt with Margaret, the nights she'd sung me to sleep. I held a pen, writing a letter to her, my words flowing like thread. "Thank you, Mama, for teaching me fire, honor, love, family. You're my light, always." I folded it, the paper crisp under my fingers, and slipped it into her hand, her smile a mirror of my own. James sat close, his arm around me, and I leaned into him, the wool of his sweater soft against my cheek. The firelight danced, casting shadows that felt like memories. Our wedding, cold and forced. The hospital, where fear had met hope. The garden, where he'd claimed my heart with a truth. "I belong to you." I looked at him now, his face softened by the glow, and knew he was no longer the ruthless man I'd married. He was mine, as I was his, bound not by duty, but by choice. "Mama." Rose kissing my forehead and left us to the quiet. We sank onto the couch, a blanket draping over us, its weight a gentle embrace. The fire crackled, and James pulled me closer, his breath warm against my hair. "You're my forever," he whispered, his voice a vow that echoed Mama's fire. I smiled, my hand resting on his chest, feeling his heartbeat, steady and true. "And you're mine," I said, the words a stitch in our story, final and unbreakable. I thought of the quilt Mama had sewn, each patch a piece of her heart, and knew we'd sewn our own, through doubt, forgiveness, sacrifice, love. Honor wasn't just keeping promises. It was building a home, thread by thread, fire by fire. In James's arms, I'd found mine, and I'd carry it always, as Mama had taught me. As the flames burned low, I felt a peace settle, warm and vast. If this story touches you, share a memory of your own, a love, a family, a fire that shaped you. Join us for more tales of heart and home, and let's keep these flames alive together.